I'd like to welcome you to the Reed and Christine Halliday Executive Lecture Series. Today's speaker is Whitney Johnson. Whitney is a founder and managing director of Springboard Fund and a co-founder of Clayton Christensen's investment firm, where they led the $8 million seed round for Korea's Coupang, currently valued at $2.2 billion. Previously, she was an institutional investor, ranked analyst for 8 consecutive years, and was rated by StarMine as a superior stock picker vis-a-vis her peers. Ms. Johnson is a frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review on innovation and investing. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Disrupt Yourself, Putting the Power of Disruptive Innovation to Work. In fact, she just had an article that was in the Harvard Review that I just read. She was named one of the Fortune's 55 most influential women on Twitter in 2014. That's for the planet Earth, basically. Planet Earth, go figure. She's here with her son, David, who's 18. She has another daughter, Miranda, 14. She did give me a whole much of a bio because she's going to be talking a lot about that in her talk. And so I don't want to hesitate or waste any more of her time. So let's welcome Whitney Johnson.
So when Brad asked my son, David, what... Are you on? You can hear me? So when Brad asked my son, David, what he should know about me, he said, she's a control freak. So there you go. All you need is to have children, and they really bring you right back down to size. Okay, I have a question for you. How many of you have an idea that you would like to move forward? It can be something you want to major in. It can be a person that you want to get acquainted with. It could be a business that you want to start. How many of you have that idea? Okay. Really, not everybody's hands are up. That's fascinating. How many of you have not yet moved this idea forward? Okay, so a few hands. All right, so what I'd like to do today is, as Brad mentioned, I co-founded an investment firm with Clayton Christensen, and one of the things that I had the opportunity to do is, as we applied the frameworks of disruptive innovation, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes, I realized that these frameworks not only apply to companies and to countries and to products and services, but they also apply to individuals. And in thinking about that, I realized that there are 7 variables that allow us to accelerate or decelerate movement along what I call, or what we all know as, the S-curve, if you've taken classes where you're applying that. So I'd like you to think today, as this idea that you have that you want to move forward, I'm going to go through these 7 variables and see if there's going to be some things or some practical tips that you can apply to your idea. Now, I'd like to start by telling you a story. In 2005, when some of you were still in grade school, I was working on Wall Street. I was in New York. I was covering the cement and construction sector. I actually thought I was going to cover the cement and construction sector, but I was covering telecom and media at Merrill Lynch. My job was to have an opinion on a stock, to upgrade or downgrade it, make a decision whether I thought it was a buy or a sell. Well, one day I said to one of my friends, you know what, I'm going to quit. I'm done. I'm leaving. She was dumbfounded. She said to me, are you sure? Which is really just a very polite, euphemistic way of wondering if I had lost my mind. I was at the top of my game. Just a few weeks prior to that, I had been down in Mexico City with Carlos Slim, who was the controlling shareholder of América Móvil and one of the world's richest men. He was quoting my research as I sat in the audience, hundreds of other people around me, quoting my research and referring to me as La Whitney. Meanwhile, I had people at Fidelity who would ask for my models, wanting to know whether I thought a company was a buy or a sell. And when I upgraded or downgraded a stock, it typically went up or down several percentage points. So it was with really good reason that my friend questioned my sanity, especially because getting to this place had been so hard-won. A few years prior to that, my husband and I had arrived in New York, so about 25 years ago now. He was going to get his PhD at Columbia, I was there. I had studied music in college. I had no credentials. I had no connections. And so for me, the obvious choice was to work on Wall Street. Well, after a few years, I finally had a sponsor who really believed in me. I started taking business courses at night because I had never set foot in any sort of business class. I was able to move up from secretary to investment banker to equity research analyst, and then eventually co-founded an investment firm with Clayton Christensen. So again, it was with really good reason that she questioned my sanity. Now, I would not have known to call it this then, but when I walked onto Wall Street through the secretarial back door, and then again when I left Wall Street, I had become a disruptor. Let me review for you disruptive innovation in case you're not familiar with the term. This is a term coined by Clayton Christensen to describe a low-end or new market innovation that eventually upends an industry. The disruptors secure a foothold at the low end of the market. Think about Amazon in the early 90s. And then in their pursuit of profit, they gradually produce higher performing, higher margin products. Established competitors, Barnes & Noble, Borders, could aggressively counter an attack by a low-end disruptor, but they don't. It doesn't make financial sense to defend their least profitable products when they themselves could move up market. Until, of course, it does make sense, and by then, it's too late. 2002, I had just started covering America Mobile. It is now the fourth largest wireless company in all of the world. And one of my jobs, before I could put a buy or a sell on the stock, is I had to build a financial model. I needed to make a decision about how high wireless penetration in Mexico could go. So as I'm building out my model, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, all right, well, right now, wireline penetration is about 15% in Mexico. I think it was 15. I think it could maybe grow a little bit more. Wireless at this point was 25%. So I'm looking at wireline, I'm looking at wireless, I'm looking at how many people can afford a phone, I'm looking at how many people have credit, and I think maybe, possibly, wireless penetration can get to 40%. Well, enter Carlos Slim. He saw the 40 million people that I saw, but he saw the other 60 million people in Mexico, or 60%, who wanted to communicate but couldn't. So what does he do? He offers them prepaid cards, he offers them subsidized handsets, and sure, communication was pretty bad at that point, but the sound quality over time improved in the pursuit of profit. So for me, in analyzing this company, I had a front row seat on disruption as wireless upended wireline. Now, I got the wireless penetration right directionally. Wireline penetration today has gone from 15% to about 20%. Wireless has gone from 25% not to 40%. Anybody want to hazard a guess? 80%? Very good, close, 90%. So directionally, like I said, I was right, but 40%, 90%, I was off pretty far. Now, what that means is that when you're in a climate of disruption, you are dealing with time delays. When systems behave linearly, we're fairly accurate with our forecasts. So for example, wireless was introduced in Mexico in 1988. For an entire 10 years, wireless penetration was less than 1% for 10 years until 1998. So it made sense that I would continue to think it was just going to be over one, up one. But when things stop being linear, our predictive power plummets. Meaning, for the individual who is experiencing an upheaval in what their industry looks like, Booyah for the 60 million people who can now afford a phone. But for the individual who is now no longer sitting in the audience on disruption, but is actually on stage, disruptive innovation can be pretty unsettling. And that's where you are. You're going to graduate. You are going to go out and look for a job. You are going to experience this seismic shift. Now, there are some ways, the S-curve that helps us gauge how quickly an innovation will be adopted also helps us deal with these time delays, providing milestones that we can watch for. At the low end, growth will be slow. Once you reach penetration of roughly 10%, see if I can get this thing to work. Okay. Oh, cool. Okay. Once you reach 10%, then you enter hypergrowth, and then once you reach saturation, which is roughly 90%, then growth tapers off. For example, Facebook. It took Facebook 4 years to reach penetration of 10%. But once it reached 100 million users, it entered hypergrowth. And over the next 4 years, it added not 100 million, but 800 million users. We could quibble over whether or not it has reached saturation, but there is no question that the rate of growth has begun to slow. Now here to me is what is really exciting. The S-curve also helps us understand the psychology of innovation. For example, you just started a new class, you just started a new job. The S-curve tells you that initially it will look like you're making absolutely no progress at all. This helps you avoid discouragement. Then as you put in the hours, you accelerate into competence and confidence. And then as you approach mastery, the less you're going to enjoy the feel-good effects of learning. Boredom can kick in. If at this point you don't jump to a new curve, your plateau can become a precipice. Remember your senior year in high school? Remember your senior year in college? Well, maybe for some of you coming up, you're probably getting a little bit bored. You're probably not working as hard as you were when you were a junior. That's because you're reaching the top of the curve and it's time for you to get ready to jump to a new curve. You'll go back to the low end, you'll have a new job, and you won't feel like you know what you're doing again, and then you'll start all over. There are volumes of research indicating that the odds of success improve for companies, even countries, when you pursue a disruptive course. I believe this mindset, though, really begins with the individual. If you can learn to ride the waves of learning and maxing out, you will have a competitive advantage in an era of accelerating disruption. And like I said a moment ago, there are 7 variables, whether a company or an individual, that help you accelerate movement along the curve. So the first one is to take the right risks. People don't buy products. They hire them to fill needs. Disruptors look for needs not being met and then try something new. Now, a lot of you have taken business courses. If one of your colleagues comes to you and says, there is a huge market out there and I have got the projections to prove it, it's quite likely that you will be looking at competitive risk because someone's already scoped out the market. They've already built projections. But if instead they come to you and say, you know what, I don't know if there's a market out there, but I think there's a need not being met, that's taking on market risk. And counterintuitively, it's less risky. One of my friends, she has, review, market risk, try something new rather than compete against an established curve of learning. All right, one of my girlfriends has triplets. When they were 11 years old, they decided that they wanted to earn some money. So they set up a lemonade stand. Now, instead of the usual in front of the house or even in front of the supermarket where they knew there would be a lot of potential customers, they set up next to a football field after football practice on a hot day. These 11-year-olds, they understood market risk. Now, there was no guarantee that there were going to be customers like there would have been in front of the supermarket. But if there were going to be customers, the entire market would be there for the taking because there were no competitors, which in fact it was. These 11-year-olds, they made $75 in about 20 minutes. Southern New Hampshire University. How many of you have heard of this school? Just a few, okay. So Southern New Hampshire University, about a decade ago, it was a 2,000-person college with declining enrollment. Now, instead of trying to increase enrollment by trying to get these Ivy League caliber professors at the high end, or by trying to compete with community-funded or government-funded community colleges, at the low end, they chose to play where no one else was playing, online. No guarantee that there would be students. But because Southern New Hampshire was willing to take on market risk, remember this was a decade ago, they have become the Amazon of education. Today they have 34,000 students, which is a 17-fold increase. And they're in the process of jumping to yet another curve, competency-based education, where students pay by time, not credit. One student was able to demonstrate all 120 competencies in less than 6 months, and his associate's degree cost $1,250. Pretty inexpensive. Utah Valley University. This is a disruptor. Think about it. Started in 1941. The initial idea was, well, we'll take the people who can't get into BYU. They went and played, or you played, where no one else was playing. Well, what's happened? By initially starting at the low end, taking the people that no one else wanted, what's happened? The average GPA of your school has gone on up steadily and steadily and more and more. The average SAT and ACT scores have gone up. You're now the largest state college in all of Utah. You have been a low-end disruptor, and now you are upending the educational institutions in this state. Okay, what I'd like to do now is I want to ask you a few questions, and because we don't have a lot of time, I just want you to think about this really quickly. So that idea that you were thinking about moving forward, whether it's a business idea, whether it's a job that you want to get, whether it's a major you want to pursue, or whether it's someone you want to connect with, what unmet needs does your idea meet for others and for you? Are there any stakeholders who are incentivized to oppose you being successful with this idea? And how can you move toward market away from competitive risk? Meaning, how can you play where no one else is playing? All right. Disruptors identify unmet needs and then play where no one else is playing. Then they match those needs with their distinctive strengths, and that's number 2. Our distinctive strengths are the things that we do well that others within our sphere don't. Let me tell you a story about a man named Adam Richardson. Adam, as a young boy, he loved cars. And the only thing that he loved more than cars was he loved designing cars. But he wasn't your typical kid, 8, 9-year-old, because he wasn't drawing these fanciful pictures about the kind of car that he would drive when he would grow up. No, he was actually drawing cars, and he was surveying adults about what kind of car they wanted. This was really a unique and distinctive strength, not only because he was precocious, but this was 30 years ago. No one was approaching design through the lens of research. Now, what's interesting is that he didn't realize this was a distinctive strength. He goes to college, he graduates from college, he goes out and gets a job. Well, the initial job was very traditional industrial designer role. He works at Sun Microsystems in Silicon Valley. But as he starts to try to see how he measures up vis-a-vis his peers, he realizes that he is not the most brilliant stylist, but he's enthralled with and actually very, very good at market research. So once he had these pay-to-play skills of being a good industrial designer who's able to go back to school, study subjects like anthropology and art history, and eventually make the leap to his dream job at design consultancy Frog. Now, the trouble with strengths is that they typically are easy to overlook because they involve something that you do reflexively well. So here are a few clues on figuring out what your strengths are. What are the things that make you feel strong? Marcus Buckingham said, our strengths clamor for our attention in the most basic way. So you get a lot of things done every single day. Think about the things that make you feel invigorated, inquisitive, successful. Those are the things that are very likely your strength. Erin Newkirk is a really good example of building a business on what makes her feel strong. Her strength is sending notes and cards to loved ones. Seems pretty simple. But by leveraging this strength and iOS technology, she's built an app that makes it very easy for people to be thoughtful on the go. On the train, on the soccer field, in a cab, not on a plane, but in a car. And her app is now a top app in 51 countries. What exasperates you? When you're working with other people, it's quite likely that there's something that they do and you think, oh, why can't they do that better? Well, it may not be that they're not smart. It just may be that you're really, really good at it and they're bumping up against your genius. If that's happening, you may have identified one of your strengths. What do other people say you do well? Now, if you have a LinkedIn profile, that can be a clue. But the other thing that can be a clue is what are the compliments that people give you that you habitually dismiss? So for example, they say to you, you do X so well, and you go, ah, it was nothing. And you're actually not being coy. You literally believe it was nothing. It's because it was so easy for you. Or what about that other thing that they say to you, oh, you do this so well, and you think, ah, if I am told one more time that I do this thing well, why can't they tell me I do this other thing well that I worked really, really, really hard to do? That, again, is very likely one of your strengths. In fact, as you go to your career counselor, it is very likely that your superpowers are not on your resume because you overlooked them or ignored them. So look for those. Okay, number 4. Oh, how many of you have seen this movie? Okay, just a handful of you. All right, this movie, I think, illustrates what I'm trying to say very, very well about distinctive strengths. Okay, so the Kadam family, they have to leave India because of election disputes. They take refuge in France. The father buys this abandoned French restaurant, and then it happens to be across the street, 100 feet away from an upscale French restaurant. A lot of the movie, it's a comedy, and it's about the rivalry that ensues between the two restaurants. The point here, though, is that the second oldest son, Hassan, is a very gifted chef. Not surprisingly, his strength is Indian cooking. But in order for him to be able to gain standing in the French cooking community, he has to learn to cook in the French tradition. Once he can cook in the French tradition, then he's able to infuse this with the Indian cooking. And that becomes his distinctive strength, the thing that he does well that no one else in his sphere does. And that's what wins him the coveted Michelin star. So look for what you do well that others in your sphere don't. All right, strengths. What makes you feel strong, invigorated, inquisitive, successful? What exasperates you? What compliments do you dismiss? And how can you play to these strengths to get your idea done? Maybe more to the point is, are you playing to your strengths as you're trying to get this idea done? All right. Just a quick recap. Disruptors match their needs, unmet needs, with their distinctive strengths. All right, number 3, embrace constraints. We give a lot of lip service to constraints, but the fact is that embracing constraints can be pretty difficult. Now, a constraint is a lack of buy-in, expertise, time, or money that allows you to figure out what you really bring to the table. The thing about when you're starting up a new curve, you need a lot of feedback very, very quickly, and the best way to do that is to impose constraints. And skateboarders are a great example of this because skateboarders get a lot of feedback very, very quickly. Every action, every move has an immediate consequence. Now, at the low end of the curve, you are very likely to have lots of constraints. You may not have very much money. You may not have very much expertise. You may not have very much buy-in for your ideas. And so what you're going to have to do is decide, am I going to embrace these constraints or am I going to give up? But then comes the hard part. Just ask people who are 20 or 30 years older than you are. What you will find is that once you start to be successful, you don't need to embrace constraints anymore. You have to create them. And in order to be able to have the wherewithal to continue to climb these curves, it's important to know how to create constraints as well. Now, a good example of how and why to do this is a company called Intuit, who brought us QuickBooks and TurboTax. The VP of Product Development was given the mandate to improve the lives of India's 1.2 billion people. Amazingly, they didn't throw a lot of resources at this. They sent 3 engineers to rural India for 3 weeks and they just said, oops, excuse me. Oh, you know what? I'm going to back up because you need to see this. Okay, here's what I want you to know about this slide. So, all right, I need to pause here. I wasn't going to tell you this. I have the flu today. So if I'm a little bit rattled, please forgive me, and I do apologize for that. But I did not want to skip today. Okay, here's what I want you to know about here. In 2007, Entrepreneur Magazine put together a list of the 500 fastest growing companies in the United States. What was really interesting about this list is not just that there were fast-growing companies, but how these companies actually funded themselves. What you see from this slide is only 28% had access to bank loans or lines of credit, only 18% to equity funding, and only 4% had access to venture capital. What this means is that at least 50% and as much as 72% of these businesses bootstrapped, meaning they started with the cash, the time, the expertise, and the buy-in that they had on hand. Now, a great example of this story is a woman who just lives up the road. Her husband was in school. He was at the University of Utah, and they were struggling to make ends meet. He's working, installing Windows part-time. She decides, or gets this idea actually, why not get permission to break out the glass from the old aluminum frames and recycle the aluminum for cash. With the $200 she earned, she goes to a local garage sale, she gets this big bag of leather, she buys a sewing machine, she sits down at her kitchen table, she figures out how to make baby moccasins. Well, last year, Susan Peterson's business, Freshly Picked, was featured on Shark Tank, where she did a deal with Damon John, and Mark Cuban said, "This is one of the best entrepreneurial stories I have ever heard." Pretty great story, huh? Started with aluminum frames. Okay, now let me go back to this story that I was telling you about the engineers in India. Remember I just said they could have thrown a lot of resources at this. This is a Fortune 500 company, but they send these 3 engineers to rural India for 3 weeks and they just say, figure something out. Didn't give them money, they gave them a very limited amount of time. And so what they do is they meet up with some local farmers during a torrential downpour, and they discover that these farmers are having trouble getting access to commodity prices. Okay, great. They now have a problem. How are we going to solve this problem? But they still didn't throw a lot of money at it. They just started manually texting price and buyer information. Well, eventually, and today, FOSL is known as a sophisticated text message-based platform using complicated algorithms to help farmers get the best prices. It has over 2 million users who enjoy a 20% increase in their bottom line. All because Intuit imposed and the engineers embraced their constraints. There is a story told of a man who bought a new pickup truck. He was very excited about the pickup truck. He drives up into the mountains, gets up into the mountains, and his truck gets stuck. His wheels are spinning. What's he going to do? Well, he decides, I'm going to get out of the truck. I'm going to start chopping firewood. He chops firewood. He fills up the back of the truck with all the firewood he can. He's now got this huge load on the back of the truck, which I would call a constraint. And once he has that constraint, he's able to gain the traction he needs to come back down the mountain. There's another kind of constraint that I think is relevant. I was talking to a young woman who's an entrepreneur, and she was telling me that she believes that most entrepreneurs, and I would say high-achieving people in generally, over-index on mild mood disorders, depression in particular. Now, depression is a constraint. Maybe some of you struggle with this. But what's interesting about this is the other side of the depression is this mild hypomania, mild, note I said, which allows people to have the passion and the drive and the energy that they need to actually get a business going, to actually have success. And so what she believes, and the research starts to bear out, is that starting a business, starting a really grand undertaking can actually be a coping mechanism for depression. In fact, she's willing to bet real money that most entrepreneurs over-index on mild mood disorders. One more story on constraints. In 1954, an editor at Houghton Mifflin read the now very famous article called Why Johnny Can't Read. Concerned, he reached out to one of his friends and he said, I need you to write me a story that 6-year-olds can't put down, but you can only use 225 words. Well, it took this friend 18 months. At one point, he got so discouraged, he almost gave up. But when Theodore Geisel published The Cat in the Hat in 1957, it was an instant hit. Years of reciting rhymes, of creating cartoons, of leveraging what he did uniquely well, prepared Geisel to reinvent children's literature when presented with a 225-word constraint. I learned to read on Go Dog Go. I'm so glad that Dr. Seuss kept going. What are your constraints? If only I had, if you find yourself saying that, you probably need to be embracing your constraints. If you're wondering how you're doing, which is one of the reasons grades can be helpful, you may need to create constraints. In what ways are your constraints indispensable to your progress? And then the last one is love your mother, because necessity is the mother of invention. Okay, constraints aren't a check on absolute freedom. They are a tool of creation. Okay, number 4, battle entitlement. This is the idea that the rules don't apply to me, or I exist, therefore I deserve. In one of the startups I backed, we had allocated $600,000, $90,000, I don't know where I got $600,000, $90,000 for a particular expenditure, and at the very last minute, one of the senior decision makers unilaterally made changes, none of which were critical, just to throw their weight around. This led to a crippling overage of $30,000, which was a factor in the business's demise. Because of this person's entitlement, innovation, jobs, growth, a company, and lots of money, my money, our money, was lost. Now, another kind of entitlement happens when we believe we don't need to listen to people who aren't like us. This is well documented when it comes to men and women, in particular, women and men not listening to other women. Did you know that a woman has to be 2.5 times more productive, meaning she has to write more papers, do more research, in order to be judged on equal footing when trying to get grants to do scientific research? Now, as a woman, I have to confess, that's pretty dispiriting. But if we all know that this widespread systemic bias exists, then we'll use this to our advantage. If you're running a business, if you're trying to get a project done, you are going to want men and women on your team, because having men and women on a team raises the team's collective intelligence and its ability to solve complex problems. Okay, this one I'm going to go through quickly. The idea here is when you are trying to move your ideas forward, whether it's your major, your business idea, getting the job you want, one of your biggest constraints is going to be getting buy-in, getting the other person on the other side of the table to buy into what you have to offer. Now, when you're doing that, it's very easy to frame it as a battle, David versus Goliath, disruptor versus disrupted. You'll know that you're doing that if you're saying words like bureaucratic or rigid or robotic, but you'll also know based on your pronouns. Mary Piper said that when we are in trouble with pronouns, we are usually struggling with us versus them issues. Think about when you're dating, that magical moment when you go from you and me to we. Pronouns are very important. Watch those pronouns. Frame the conversation when you're trying to get buy-in for your ideas as we. And if you like basketball, you'll think of it as Alonzo Mourning and Bugsy Mogues. You're all on the same team. David and Goliath, they're not competitors, they're on the same team. Okay, battle entitlement. From whom do you need buy-in to get this job that you really want? Who is us? Who is them? Do you see your professor as them? Do you really want your professor to be them, or aren't you us? Because they want to teach as badly as you want to learn or get a good grade. What language does them speak? Now translate. Who considers you them, and why? If you're entitled, now this goes more for the professors. If you have the title of a professor, are you entitled? Here's what I want you to remember. The people you are inclined to dismiss, that you think of as a gadfly, oh, they're kind of annoying, are likely the people that can deliver very important insights if you have the humility to listen. Step back in order to grow. Now, when companies get too big, they often stop exploring smaller opportunities because the revenue just isn't big enough. We see examples of this all the time. We saw it with Yahoo. We saw it with Borders. Now, the way you solve this is you jump to a new curve. And this happens as well for individuals. If you're stalling at the top of your personal learning curve, you jump to a new curve. And it doesn't necessarily mean you need to change majors or you need to change jobs. Dave Blakely, he started his career as an engineer at IDEO. He could have worked his way up to manage technical staff, but instead he volunteered to become a project manager. A lot of his engineering colleagues dismissed this as an escape route from the rigor and detail of engineering, but Blakely knew that this backward move could help him begin to climb a new ladder. And today, he's the head of all of technology strategy at IDEO, which would not have happened if he had just stuck with engineering. Here's my question. For whom is your idea a step back? Maybe you want to change majors and other people are thinking, why do you want to do this? Why do stakeholders think you're cuckoo bananas? And how can your new trajectory intersect with where you want to go? When you're thinking about taking this step back, when you're thinking about disrupting yourself, beware the undertow of the status quo. There are going to be lots of stakeholders who like you right where you are. But you know that if you take this step back, It just may turn into a slingshot. Failure. How many of you have ever failed? Don't raise your hands, because it's going to be everybody. Okay, whenever you try something new, there is a fantasy of a simple linear world. You will work hard, and your dream will come true. And sometimes it doesn't. My whales of fails include not making cheerleader my junior year in high school. My voice cracked in front of the entire assembly. It was terribly embarrassing. Bombing a speech in front of hundreds of people, being fired, and backing a business that imploded, which involved losing a lot of money. When I fail, no matter how many chirpy quotes I tweet, I am despondent, pessimistic, and I want to move to another city because I can never show my face in public ever again. Marjorie Howell said, "There is dignity in suffering, nobility in pain, but failure is a salted wound that burns and burns again." The psychologist Brene Brown said that failure is especially acute for athletes, the military, and corporate professionals. When the ethos is kill or be killed, control or be controlled, failure is being killed. And it elicits tremendous shame. Steve Jobs. We think of him as this iconic founder unveiling the next insanely great product. But did you know he was also the despairing founder, curled into a fetal position, sobbing on a mattress when the Apple board fired him in 1985? You probably didn't know that, but he was. When I fail, I'm embarrassed, but I'm also heartbroken. There was this dream of something I was going to accomplish. I was maybe even going to be hailed the conquering hero, and then I didn't, and I wasn't. It's important to grieve. When we sublimate the sadness, we risk losing our passion. And we also need to ditch the shame. Daring to disrupt is daring to fail. And I'm not talking just about that low-end failure, low end of the curve failure. I'm talking about having the nerve to take on really big failures. Now, there's this book in the management literature by Carol Dweck. She's a social psychologist. And what did she say? She said, success hinges not only on your innate ability, but on whether or not you view the world with a fixed or a growth mindset, meaning your capacity can grow or it's fixed. Now, I bet most of you in this room are going to say to me, oh, I believe that I can change and grow. But you know what? We don't always believe that, because every time you get a grade on a test that you don't want, and that grade somehow in your mind makes you feel like you are fundamentally unworthy, you have toggled over to the fixed mindset. Think about that. Sometimes you have to step back in order to grow. Sometimes you need to take the hardest class you can find. If you haven't taken calculus, take calculus. Take those hard classes. Step back in order to grow. Get a B in order to grow. Here's my question for you now. Do you try to hide your failures? Why? Who hides their failures from you? Why? If you failed with your current idea, what would happen? What would it look like? Okay, I'm going to go through the rest of this really fast. So, when you're pursuing a disruptive course, it's important that you are discovery-driven. You're looking for a yet-to-be-defined market. You can't know the end from the beginning, the top of the curve from the bottom of the curve. The good news is that you won't be alone. 70% of all successful businesses end up in a different place, too. Groupon started out as an activism platform, bringing people together to fundraise for a cause or to boycott a retailer, which is very ironic. Netflix started out as a door-to-door DVD rental service. You will find in your career that what you think you're going to do, 70% of you will end up with something different. And that's okay. You've Got to get your metrics right as you're trying to measure this. How many of you have seen Moneyball? I love this story because Billy Beane got the metrics right. He didn't measure what people typically measure. He didn't look at what they looked like. He didn't look at how fast they were. He looked at things like ground ball to fly ratio. And pitcher Chad Bradford, he looked funny when he pitched, but he had a very high ground ball to fly ratio, so they acquired him. Learning is the essential unit of progress. What is the next thing you need to learn about your idea? Okay, we're wrapping up. The most important metric of success is how many times you show up. Did you know that the odds of a scientist writing a groundbreaking research paper is correlated not to how smart the scientist is, but to how many papers the scientist has written? It's not how smart you are, it's how much you show up. Once a startup makes it to the final round of a pitch contest, there's no statistical difference between the returns of the finalists and the actual winners. It's called the equal odds rule. If you want to get good at jumping from one curve to the next, jump. If you want to be successful at work, show up and keep showing up. The other thing that the textbooks on disruption don't tell you is that sometimes it's really lonely and scary. When I disrupted myself, I left Wall Street. After the thrill wore off, there were days when I felt a loss of identity. I could no longer call people and say Whitney Johnson, Merrill Lynch. Now it was just Whitney Johnson. Some days that wasn't enough. There were other days where the PE or puke to excitement ratio was so uncomfortably high, I felt like I was on a thrill ride to zero cash flow. It doesn't mean you shouldn't disrupt. It just means if it's scary and lonely, you're probably on the right track. In fact, if you have a feeling in the deepest part of yourself that you need to try something new and you don't, you'll die inside a little. That's why we call it the innovator's dilemma. Whether you innovate or not, you risk downward mobility, which is why our dreams are so important. Our dreams help make us problem solvers. Dreaming is the engine of disruption, and the odds of success are 6 times higher, the revenue opportunity 20 times greater when you pursue a disruptive course. I'm going to skip this slide. The last thing I want you to know is that it's important to show up to your dreams. Sarah Ban-Breathnock said, when you use expectations to measure a dream success, you tie stones around your soul. Dreams may call for a leap of faith, but they set the soul soaring. Most of us are quite adept at doing the math around the future when things are linear, but neither business nor life is linear. And ultimately what the brain craves, even requires, is the delicious dopamine of the unpredictable. Saul Kaplan, chief catalyst of the Business Innovation Factory, said, my life has been about searching for the steep learning curve because that's where I do my best work. And when I do my best work, money, stature, and happiness have always followed. We give a lot of airtime to building and buying disruptive companies, and we should. But innovation begins on the inside. We start at the low end of the curve. We shift into gears that will allow us to scale. And when our learning crests, we do what all great disruptors do. We walk straight into the innovator's dilemma and jump to a new curve. Because companies don't just disrupt, people do. Thank you.